after c4, e5. So white is playing the English, and then g3. We're going to look at a few lines, a few things we haven't seen at all so far. So we know we played knight f6 now, and after bishop to g2, the fianchetto of the English has been placed where it belongs. Now we play d5, as mentioned in the previous videos. After take, a move we haven't seen at all now is knight to c3. So far, we've only been going through knight f3 instead of knight c3, and then, well, okay, things, what you're going to do here is just develop the bishop to the usual square, bishop e6. So in case white plays knight f3, there's going to be a transposition, right? You're going to play knight c6, bishop e7, and so on. But here now, because we're looking at, in particular at the knight c3 variation, so remember, this is the English where white doesn't play knight f3. Okay, at least not immediately. Okay, we play bishop e6, and now two moves we're going to look at. They're typical moves in this type of positions. One of them is queen to b3, immediately going for a triple attack on this knight and an attack on this pawn. And this is an annoying move, because I've encountered this well, lots of times before I started studying what to do against the English. I remember how I used to have like an headache and think for like a minute before playing my next move. So let's start with this. Queen b3, what is the move? Triple attack on the knight, also an attack on this weak pawn. Knight to b4 is the most accurate way to continue. Okay, and now we're simply discovering an attack on this queen. The queen will have to move, and then we can carry on with the game. And now the funny thing is, obviously, okay, if the queen goes back to d1, then that was a waste of tempos, and you're okay. You're just going to play knight a to c6, you're developing, and you're going to carry on like this. White just wasted two tempos. If, or I should say tempi, because a tempi is the plural of tempo. But anyway, after a3, attacking the knight, seems like you're going to play the knight in this uncomfortable square, or maybe back to d5. However, knight to d4 already gets a winning advantage, because now you're going to play knight c2 check, and you're going to win the exchange. This cannot be met with pawn taking the knight, because bishop b3 simply traps the queen. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't come at any compensation at all, but definitely, I mean, position evaluated -3. So let's go back here. After knight b4, releasing an attack on the queen, queen check. Okay, develop the other knight. And now, after knight f3, well, okay, instead of knight f3, what about the knight being kicked out now? Are we going to these uncomfortable squares? Well, actually, no, because the bishop's attacking there, the queen's attacking there, so you're losing material. Knight d5 comes now, and basically, once again, the opponent has just wasted tempos. Fine, what about b4? Threatening to play b5, then the knight has to move, and then there will be discovered attacks. It's kind of like, you know, that's how they usually play this type of move. You play f5, and when b5 comes, you play knight to d4, and you don't have to worry about anything. What about check? Okay, c6, and that's going to be it. You can also take this one with an attack the queen. It's a disaster. Like, you know, if the pawn takes instead, well, you take this one, and then when they take you back, you can recapture this pawn. Hehe. What are you going to do now? The queen will have to move again, but then you've got infiltration on these lines and squares. It's amazing. If the queen does take you, then knight c2 is checkmate next move. So let's go back here, right? After queen a4 check, we develop the knight in c6, and let's look at knight f3, another developing move, instead of white realizing that it's just been wasting tempos. Bishop to d7 comes now, and now we got a few threats. So, for instance, a3 attacking the knight, you play knight to d4 once again. The queen can't take us the bishop, the pawn can't take us the queen, and we've got double attack over c2 and an attack on the queen. So that's going to be it. If instead of a3, queen back to d1, knight d4 comes anyway. And once again, we're going to that square. Two options here now, either castle or knight taking this tremendous knight. Okay, well, if castle, let's say, okay, check. Bishop takes, and now bishop c6, forcing a swap with the strong English bishop. So bishop goes back, queen to d2, or queen to d7. Attack on the knight? Fine, take this one, comes with an attack on the rook, so this has to be taken. Now knight back to c6. What we have achieved is a very weak white king. Okay, d3 to allow development of the bishop. d4 is not possible, as you can see. Long castle. Now the only way to attack for white will be obviously on where our king is. So b4. Now you play h5. So they attack you on this side, you attack on the other side. h4 stopping, because we were going to play h5, right? I mean h4. So h4, fine, you play king b8. And here's how it's gonna work. You're gonna play f5, f4. And that's unstoppable because there's a certain control of the dark squares around the white king. So you're gonna play f5, f4. So let's say, for instance, bishop to b2, f5. We never have to worry about the knight being attacked. Let's say, for example, b5 attacking the knight, and then a4, a5, as we know this is about to happen, because knight d4 is a perfect square for the knight. And you can say, yes, the knight can be kicked out from that square, but then that means that the pawn in d3 will be weak for the rest of the game. Also, you're attacking this this pawn right now. So instead of e3, what about a4? Proceeding with the plan. You're pushing these pawns, and eventually you're attacking on this side. It's fair enough. g5, and this is what you want to do against the king. When the bishop is gone, all you need to do is just swap. Whether they take you or you take them, you're gonna open the files inevitably. And if they take you, for example, you might argue that h4 is not the right move here because the rook can come here and pin the pawn, and it's annoying. Here you play bishop e7 just to recapture the pawn. If e3 comes now, knight e6, finishing the attack on that pawn. If f4 comes instead, seems to be making sense. But now you can play h4. Obviously now the bishop is developed, so we are happy about it. So rook h1. You can take the pawn, and then you can take this one, and then you can take this one. They're all falling. If instead the white player had taken this pawn first, well, obviously after rook h4, then you can double up the rooks. You're also attacking here as well. Position evaluated minus 450 or something, so let's leave it there. And let's go back to this position. Earlier, as soon as we played knight d4, what if the knight just takes us and say, that knight, you're a troublemaker. Okay, well, fine, take back. Now, obviously, we're going to go through knight b1, because where else can the knight go? Can't really move anywhere. If knight e4, f5 traps the knight. If instead knight d5, then bishop c6, and you double attack on this piece, the knight can't take your knight, because when you take this bishop, comes with an attack on the rook, and the bishop's attacking this one as well. So there's going to be hanging stuff. e4 to protect the knight, maybe. But now you take en passant, and you've got, if the pawn takes you to release more defense over this square, it's not enough, because you've got 3 attackers, right? And only 2 defenders. So the knight will have to take you. And then you make a check, and then the king moves. And then queen f6, threatening mate, and then queen e2 defending that. And attacking the knight, fine, castle. Position evaluated minus 4. Taking here will be really bad, because then when the queen will be attacking the rook, the king gets even weaker. The plan here now is to simply play bishop c5 and then take this knight. And then you have an idea of taking the pawn in f2. This will have to be taken with the queen. So here's the plan, right? You want to do this, this, and that, and then knight f2. And then you can infiltrate in here. White is, in the meantime, not able to develop anything. So back in this position, knight d5, knight e4 just lose. What about knight b1? Okay, well, still, d3. And now you're threatening knight c2 with a check winning the rook. Okay, knight a3, stopping that. Bishop to g4. Finalizing the attack over this weak diagonal. And it's not like the bishop can interpose and play bishop f3, for example, because you can take it. Pawn takes back. And position is already evaluated as if black was up a piece. You're going to play queen f6, castle, and then the idea of playing rook e8 check. Closing the game, really. Now, okay, so what can the opponent do? Okay, white, let's say castles, because it's not like you can ever castle that side anyway. And it's not like this knight can ever be kicked out. Queen a4 check doesn't do anything, because when you block, the knight is defended. So after castling, you play h5 with the idea of playing h4. If in case you can play also g5. This bishop is completely harmless. Okay, well then we castle. And now the plan is still to play h5. And we're gonna play h5, h4. White can't develop the bishop from the fianchetto either. So that bishop, that rook, they just cannot play. Black can't move a thing. This is so funny. Okay, let's see. Rook e1. Maybe the idea of going to rook e3 and start applying pressure on that pawn. But still, h5. How are you going to stop h4? Because we can also always play g5 as well. This bishop is unable to play this game. So back in this position, straight after playing bishop g4, finalizing the attack over this square. What about f3? Seems to be making sense. Fine, you take this one. Comes with an attack on the queen. So the queen has to take, and it's check. So now you have to save the bishop to e6. Did we just give up the initiative? No. Castle. Bishop c5 check. This can be blocked with the pawn, of course. King moves, and now queen to d3 imposes a swap of queens. Okay, let's say, why does it impose it? if the queen goes, let's say, to e4, for instance, right? Obviously, taking means that this bishop, once again, will never develop. If the queen tries to move away, you castle long, because there's an attack on b7, and then you carry on. If instead the queen goes to e5, with an attack on this bishop, with an attack on this pawn, it looks terrible. You play b6 to defend the pawn, and when the queen takes you here, you castle long. And now what to do? You can see how strong these rooks are going to be very soon against that poor lonely king. If queen h6 to start getting away from trouble, bishop to d4. Now, if the knight moves away to b1, for example, you simply play knight c2, trapping the rook. If the rook goes to b1, then you simply take this pawn, trapping the rook. If instead any developing move, let's say rook e1, right, just to make an example, we play rook h to e8. Since the queen went to h6, this is a computer move, white played the best move, which is there, queen h6 is there to stop the pawn from being able to advance. Play rook h to e8. And the idea is one and simple. Bishop to g4, forcing a trade of rooks, and going for checkmate. And the funny thing is that this just cannot be stopped properly because our opponent can never develop this bishop. And the bishop d4 move was so amazing because it stopped the development through the fianchetto as well. Let's take it from the start and let's look at something that we haven't seen yet from the same line. So d5 take, and now we're looking at the early knight c3. So the English game without knight f3. So we said we continue the normal development, and now instead of queen b3, the whole thing, what about d4, which is the most popular move and the strongest move? Well, we have to take the pawn. Now, queen takes back, and now we come with development, knight c6. Two options we're going to look at. Briefly, we're looking at these two lines, and then we're going to change. For example, if the queen goes to d1 all the way back, you simply take this knight, and the pawn will have to take. It comes with an attack on the queen, but then if you take the queen, your opponent loses the right to castle. And then white has lost every advantage that there is by being white, So queen takes, at least not ruining the pawn structure, the king's castle, right? Take back, and after the bishop takes, the knight. These are all best moves by white. This is just to destroy the pawn structure. Now you're gonna have to take, and so white takes back, and white says, I've got an isolated pawn, but so do you. So let's keep going. Okay, bishop d6, develop. Knight f3, king d7. There's no reason to castle. We're gonna play the rooks on the open files, and the king is safe in there. You might want to play also this move. The queens are off the board, so who cares? Castle c5. Okay, rook to d1, pinning the bishop and developing. Okay, king to c6. And this is how you play. There's no access to the white pieces, and also the king is ready for the endgame. So the king is quite centralized already. Rook to b1, developing. Okay, rook to b8, force a trade of rooks. If the bishop moves just to develop, for instance, fine, then just take, and then this pawn is safe to be taken, although it looks like rook a1 should win this pawn. But then you play bishop to c4. So if the king moves now to defend the pawn, you play rook a8, and this pawn is gonna march. If instead of king f1, white plays knight to d2, attacking the bishop, and just coming closer to into the game. Also, rook a8 is still a threat. Well, then you take this pawn. Now it looks like white is developing. Maybe white is like kind of finding some sort of counterattack. But now you play rook b8, and the back rank is very weak. What are you going to do now? Knight e4 to make an example, attacking this bishop, trying to remove the bishop pair from us. Check. King moves. Bishop to c4, threatening to pin the knight. And now if, let's say, the knight takes the bishop, just take back with the pawn. The bishop is defending here, and basically white will be fixing your pawn structure, and you're winning because of the passed pawn you're going to create here. What about instead knight to g5, attacking this pawn? Fine, give a check. King has to move. But then you play h6 and the knight is trapped. Even if if the knight had gone there, then that piece is properly pinned. This rook has no prospect of doing anything at all. This bishop is completely useless. We're going to be taking this pawn. If instead in this position f3, well, obviously you're going to attack the knight once again, and then you got an attack. You got checks. Well, obviously now you play rook b3, you win that pawn. This cannot be blocked here because you can pin the bishop. So let's close it there. So back in this position, earlier we went through the queen retreating to d1 after being attacked by the knight in c6. What about the queen goes to d2, trying to safeguard the pawn structure? Although this is not really possible. So now you're going to play bishop b4, pinning the knight. They're attacking you, fine, take with the bishop. Pawn takes back, and we are going to succeed in breaking the pawn structure anyway. Castle. Okay, knight f3 looks like a normal game. What's going on? Where's the treat? It's here. Queen f6. Finalizing the pressure on that pawn. We should be able to take it. Castle. Now we don't really go for that pawn yet. Rook a to d8. And after bishop b2, it looks like this is a good way to protect that pawn. Threatening c4, extremely powerful move. Attacking the knight, attacking the queen. It's a disaster. You're going to play knight b6. Save the knight. And now there's an attack on the queen. Queen c2, moving away. Rook f to e8. These rooks are really good. And we're fighting 3 pawns against 2. Let's make some example of how this game will more or less go. c4, releasing an attack on the queen. Queen f5. Queen c3, going for checkmate, is blocked with f6. That's how it works. Let's make an example. If rook a to d1, you just take this pawn. It's free. If knight goes to h4, attacking the queen, queen to c5, finalizing the attack on that pawn. Rook a to c1 to protect and more. Pin your own piece. That's fine. We don't care. Because that knight cannot be attacked by anyone. Bishop a1, saving itself from the knight. Not that you could take the bishop already, but you were going to do it eventually. Knight to d4. Threatening knight d2, conquering glory. Rook f to e1, protecting it. And now c6. Solidifying the pawn chain here so that this bishop becomes completely useless. And now the idea of the black player is to simply win this pawn in a3, and then we just like we got 3 passed pawns, right? All of them passed and connected pawns. There's nothing to do. Even if a4 comes, queen a3, and you're forcing a swap of queens, and you should be able to take this queen in case they don't want to swap. But I don't really see any square to go to for that queen. And everything is safe and nothing can be done by our opponent to resist in this endgame. It's 3 pawns against 1. So let's make a mention now of something a little bit different. So when g3 is played, right, to do the fianchetto, knight f6, and what about knight c3? Basically, this is now, try to remember the patterns, obviously, memorizing moves is crazy. When they play knight c3 without the knight in f3 and without the bishop, you still need to play d5, and after take, there's this variation. Well, obviously now bishop g2 gives birth to a perfect transposition from before. Then later we're also going to look at knight f3, so basically the 2 knights without the bishop developed. This is the all swap variation. It needs to be done because they keep playing it against me, so I had to make a video, but it's really annoying. It makes everything boring, like this defense is anyway, even more boring. Knight takes, queen takes with an attack on the rook. So after knight f3, you play e4, attacking the knight. The knight will have to move. 2 squares we're going to look at. One of them is, let's say, if the knight goes back to g1, which is kind of like still theory, I think. Knight c6, bishop to g2, looks like white is doing okay. Bishop to f5, protect that pawn more. Although it looks like that pawn is pinned. d3, we don't care, we castle. And now that pawn is pinned as well. This d3 pawn is now pinned. You want to pin us? I'll pin you. So bishop to g5, attacking the rook, queen a5 check. This cannot be met with the queen because bishop b4 will pin the queen. So the bishop is penalized and has to go back to d2, but now you play bishop to b4. And when they take you, you take back with the knight. Because it's not like our opponent could develop the knight here. It's not like they could take the pawn. There's no way to release the pressure. Take back with the knight. Now you're threatening double checks that are horribly strong. If king goes to f1, then you just take this pawn. Position is completely winning. You got like 3,000 attackers over this square. And back in this position, when we played bishop b4, we went through bishop swapping. What about, you may argue, okay, look, there's 2 attackers, but there's 2 defenders. What about they attack us? Well, fine, now you have to take. And after queen takes, you refuse the swap by going queen to b6. Although it's a bit weird. Because you could take the queen, king takes, and you can take this pawn with a triple attack. But this is the most accurate way to respond. You are still threatening to do this, by the way. So what if queen c3, I'm pinning the pawn? Well, fine, now we finally take it. And now taking back leads to an absolute disaster. You got an attack here, you got a check here. If knight f3 developing, well, you just take this pawn, and that king cannot castle. There is no coming back. There wasn't already. King e2 is just appallingly stupid move, because yes, you might want to connect the rooks and do this, but it's just too late because the development is just too strong. Look at this. Look how many attacks. So obviously that pawn was there to stay. It couldn't be taken. So let's make a recap and let's go through that line once again. So g3, knight f6, knight c3, d5, and this is when they decide, obviously d5, take, and this is when they decide to take everything. Now knight f3 has to be played, e4. Instead of knight g1, what about knight h4? Okay, fine, you play knight to c6, and after e3, obviously because you gotta develop. I mean, what else is there to be played? g2 is not possible because g2 is the only escape square for the knight. g5 will trap the knight. d3 is not possible because after taking this pawn, you're attacking this rook. Although to be honest, the most accurate move is bishop to b4 check. This is met with the only possible response, which is bishop d2. And now you actually play e3, and there's an attack on this rook. And yeah, pawn taking is completely pointless. You're going to attack in the rook. If they take the bishop, looks for some sort of compensation, then just go for the rook. Obviously, this pawn can't take you now or something. You're attacking this bishop. Let's not forget. Queen a4 pins the knight, develops the queen, and prepares long castle. Our opponent might have some heroic idea of playing for compensation, which is fair enough at the end of the day. But now you simply take this pawn, and after castle, you take this one. It's just too much advantage. Although white is very well developed, and we cannot castle the king, so this looks actually horrible, in a way that you're clearly completely winning. But you gotta be careful. This king is not in danger, but is not even very happy. Position is only evaluated minus 350. So yes, good and solid advantage, but still. Bishop to g2 now, putting more attack on the knight. Bishop d7, and we won a castle long side. Besides, we're threatening to discover attacks on the queen by moving the knight. We're also threatening to win this pawn with an attack on this knight. So we're gonna have to leave the line here and go back to this position. So we tried a little bit of everything, nothing really works. What about e3? Stopping the pawn from advancing, and the whole threatening diagonal is not only effective. Fine, g5. The only move now to stop to preserve the piece is knight g2, knight to e5, and now we're gonna make use of the weak light squares. Okay, queen to b3, developing, desperate for a swap. Crazy enough, we actually do swap. After take back now, bishop e6 finalizes the pressure on that pawn. b4 to save the pawn. Only way to save the pawn? Well, not really, because you take it with this bishop. You totally didn't see that. Well, neither did I when I was creating this line. Anyway, b3 to develop the bishop. Knight f3 check. Look how amazing it is when the computer plays chess. It's kind of like, you're not looking for mate, you're not looking for an advantage. You're just paralyzing the opponent on every level and then just torturing them. It's amazing. Look at this knight, can't move. This bishop can't do anything. Look, this is now check. What's going to happen now? King d1 runs straight into this beautiful check. So the king will have to go to e2 instead of d1. It will end up there anyway. Bishop to g4. So we attack the king from this diagonal since he decided to go to e2. Well, he had to go. h3 attacking the bishop. What to do? Knight d4 check. It's a double check. The king only has this square to go to, and then knight c2 is a checkmate that looks and feels pretty much like glory must feel. Okay, new topic now. In this position, so after g3 and knight f6, what about the immediate knight f3? So the English pawn has been moved, the fianchetto has been opened, but now immediately knight f3. How to react to this? So this is the English game with the knight in f3, with no knight in c3 and no bishop in fianchetto. Okay, you attack it. Attack the knight straight away. Knight d4, d5. Okay, take, and now you take with the queen. This releases an attack on the knight. What to do? e3. Kinda has to be played at this point, but now c5. Hehe, where's that knight going to go? Good luck finding somewhere good to go, Mr. Knight. So let's say if the knight goes to b3, it seems like a reasonable move. Bishop to g4 attacks the queen. This is awesome. This is such a torture. Nothing can be done at this point. It's pure torture. If bishop to e2 to block, for example, you take, and after take, knight to c6. Knight to c3, attacking the queen. Queen e6, staying relevant. And here's the problem. The problem is we can play knight b4, knight e5. There's so many very good squares to go to. And there is no way that our opponent can ever control the square d3. Let's make an example. If white castles, right? You castle. And now a move like a3 stops the knight from potentially going to b4. But then you take the knight in b3. A move like d3 or d4 cannot be played. You got too much attack on this square. A move like f3 to challenge the strong pawn in the center. Well, c4 attacks a piece. The piece will have to move. But it's uncomfortable. There's nowhere to go except d4. But now rook takes d4. Boom! It's an incredible move. This cannot even be recaptured because of the huge disaster that happens next. Pawn takes rook. Knight d4. Infiltrating the opponent territory. Like a jealous girlfriend infiltrating your phone to find out what you're doing online at 3 in the night. Only to find out that you were playing chess. And now, if the queen goes on the diagonal of her own king, then bishop c5 looks like a really strong move. If the queen goes to d1, then simply you can take the pawn in f3. Position evaluated around -5 or something. So back in this position, straight after playing c5, we went through knight b3. There's something we didn't see yet. So after knight b3, bishop g4, what about the queen moving away? Not trading this light square bishop, because this dark square bishop is very important to try and give some protection to the light squares. Okay, knight to c6. And now a move like a3, for instance, you just play bishop e6. Double attack on this knight, and the knight is trapped. That's really fun, isn't it? a3 loses the game immediately. Well, what about knight to c3, developing and attacking the queen? Queen e6. Now a3 appears to be possible to stop knight b4. Castle. And now a move like bishop g2 is met with knight e5. An absolute domination happening now. Remember, this d pawn can never really play because you can take it, and this bishop can never really play, and as a consequence this rook cannot really play. Now here, if white castles, you have a simple plan. Knight f3 check. When they take you, then you can take back, and obviously, you know, the queen is infiltrated and giving checkmate very soon. If they move, you're gonna play h5, h4, and so on, right? And then the rook will help and checkmate the opponent. This is all unstoppable, right? So in this position, where we were earlier, knight e5 is just being played. Instead of castling, which we know now is met with knight f3, super strong move. What about the knight taking this apparently free pawn? Queen a6. Threatening checkmate. And it's not like the bishop f1 can challenge the checkmate, because knight f3 check, and then the king goes here, and then you have a discovered check, and so on. And it's gonna be a disaster. So the only thing left to do here is to play f3, which is met with the surprising knight takes e4. Obviously taking back with the pawn allows us to infiltrate, so taking back with the queen is met with knight d3 check, and then you're going to play knight check here, win the queen. So if king d1, knight f2 wins the queen. If king goes to f1, well then f5. Traps the queen in a spectacular manner. Needless to say, in this position, earlier we went through bishop to g2, bishop g2, and then knight e5. If h3 attacking this bishop, you just play bishop f3, and well, the rook will have to move. Rook h2, but I play c4, and the same thing is happening. The knight is going to d4, or I mean, the knight is just lost. If the knight does go to d4, let's say for example here, you take with the rook, and you can take it from here. So let's make a recap. We're looking at the variation with the early knight f3 and the fianchetto, but without any other piece. So e4, knight d4, d5. Take, you take with the queen. So e3 defends the knight, c5. What about knight to e2? This has to be seen because it's a possible move. And the knight is threatening to go to f5. It's a horrible position, but the knight is threatening to go to f4, attacking the queen. And the opponent can breathe a little bit. Okay, bishop f5. And after knight f4, queen d7. Got already some control of the light squares. Bishop g2, developing. Knight c6. Castle. Bishop g4. Now, a move like queen b3 to develop, for example, right? g5 traps the knight. So what to do. If queen e1, well, g5 once again, and now the knight goes to e2. It's becoming such a joke. Knight to e5 with the usual idea of knight f3 is so strong. This has to be taken. The pawn has to be taken, but then you take back, and you'll take it from here. So back in this position, what about f3 to stop everything? Okay, fine, take, and after take, h5. We just want to open these files, this rook here, and we're always going to castle alongside anyway, if we ever need to castle. Okay, b3 to develop in fianchetto, knight e5. Bishop takes, we take with the pawn. And now we simply have a plan of playing queen c6, knight f3, and then it's an absolute disaster. So in this position, what about white tries to counterattack? So let's say, for example, d4. Well, you take, and when the pawn takes, you can play knight f3. And here you might argue our opponent might want to give us the exchange for all of this. Rook takes, pawn takes, and queen takes. But the problem is that you got queen takes in d4, and it's a disaster. So that's the best move. So in this position, instead of pawn recapturing, what about queen taking? Fine, you take, and now knight f3 does go for that pawn, and it's winning material no matter what. Okay, so in this position now, we're gonna go through something new. What about when they don't initiate any of those G3 move, but rather play E3? This is because they want to play D4. Okay, so you play knight F6. And after D4, take. Now check. Okay, if this is blocked, obviously in the next videos I'm going to go through some other stuff, like knight to C3, but in this video we're going through bishop blocks. Okay, take, castle. Knight F3. Check. Bishop blocks. Okay, we're gonna look at both, but even the queen can block, of course. If bishop blocks, then rook e8, capitalizing already. This is already winning for black. The white player cannot castle the king, and now you'll see how to capitalize on that poor bishop. Rook c1, for example, to develop d5. That's the move you play. And now two options. If rook to c3 with the idea of going to e3, which seems to be making sense, you take this pawn, and when the rook goes to e3, queen d8. The bishop is now apparently free to recapture this one, but now knight to c6, finalizing the attack on the pawn in d4. So if white castles, just take this pawn with the knight. And if the swaps occur, in order to save the pawn in d4, check. Okay, queen takes, but now it's check again. Bishop blocks, queen blocks. And now you take, bishop g4, with the idea of playing rook e8. So rook e1 has to happen in order to manually castle. But then you can play knight d4, right? Right, this was just an example of actually one of the most, like a computer line. White playing like a computer to resist. And now the advantage is not that great, but still. Here's the crazier line. Here, after d5, what if the white player takes? Okay, take back the knight. And I think you know where this is going. You're going to be playing knight f4 and finalizing the attack on that bishop. What if king to f1 to unpin? Okay, knight c6, develop. Bishop c4, finally unpinned, and now the game can start according to what white is thinking. Bishop e6, develop. g3, okay, well, now give up on that and just check. King has to go, so now you see how to fight against that. You might argue, why g3? Well, okay, what else do you want to play? Knight e5, you can take. Clearly, and the rooks are coming here, the opponent king cannot castle. Trading the bishop for the knight just helps us a lot. Knight e4 doesn't really do anything. You play rook a to d8. Position evaluated is -2. It looks like now white can play knight c5, attacking this, threatening to take our strong light square bishop. And that's why we need to play bishop to c8 and then b6 next move. The rook is now protecting the knight. What are we going to do about an attempt of swaps by our opponent? We don't want to. You're going to play queen f6, targeting this weak pawn, preparing bishop g4, and the rook's attacking this queen. Position evaluated -3 if you get to play these moves. So here, after g3, we're looking at g3, how to exploit this check. After king g1, now you see that the knight is under attack, so you're going to play rook a to d8. It's perfectly fine to defend it like that. Queen e1, looking for swap, queen f6, that's how you do. Bishop e2 now. What can be done, because what else was there to do? let's say if queen to d1, right, to save itself from the rook, knight to d4. And why is the position evaluated -5? After knight takes back, knight takes the knight, queen takes back, our opponent can't move anything. Besides, we're threatening to take this pawn. So knight f3, you just take that pawn. If b3, for instance, you just play knight back to f6. Position evaluated -6. This king will never move, and the king and the rook will never play. And this bishop and our very strong rooks speak for themselves. So in this position, after queen f6, instead of queen d1, what about bishop e2? Well, okay, take here now. Crazy enough. And after take, knight to f3, you take this pawn, and you're finalizing the attack over there. It's completely winning. So in this position, one move that needs to be seen is this one. Queen takes. You take back, and now bishop takes d5. Is there any compensation? No, because once again, knight d4. Also threatening knight e2. So the swaps will have to happen. Let's take it from the start, and let's look at this. So e3, knight f6, d4, take. Bishop check, bishop blocks. Castle, knight f3, check. What if they block with the queen? This is now a little bit more boring, but still, rook e8. And now you're still threatening d5, and then, knight c6, knight d4, and so on. Obviously not right now, but you can play knight b4 as well. So what about the variation where they obviously take you? Take back, and now bishop e2. They're still pinned, right? d5. Let's look at this move. Is there any way for our opponent to avoid being pinned? Now, knight e5 seems like white can castle, but you play knight c6. Now, a move like knight to f3 to support it loses to knight d4, because the knight takes back, and then this knight doesn't have a defender anymore. You can take e5. A move like knight takes this knight, pawn takes back, and now knight to f3, the idea of finally going to e5 forever and play a normal game. Bishop a6, capitalizing on that pawn. Knight a5 also defends that pawn, but now c5. We're going to produce a passed pawn, go to d3, and be extremely annoying. Okay, well, let's look at this. Castle, you take this pawn. Because what else was there to do, even if they take you? But then you have an attack on the knight, so this pawn in d4 is stuck. So now you take in d4, and now f4 protects the knight. How to continue? Pawn takes in c4. Okay, bishop takes. Take. And now knight to d5, targeting this pawn. That means if white plays rook f to d1 to attack the pawn, you just take this pawn in f4, and when the rook takes you, then knight e2 makes a fork to the rook. If instead, and even if, like, let's say this, that, this, I mean, if the rook doesn't take the pawn, but rather, so let's say, for example, rook d1 that you take here, and now g3 kicking you away, then you play knight e6, you're still protecting the pawn. So in this position, after knight d5, what about rook a to d1, attacking the pawn? And now just protected with c5.